The jungle smelled of iron, blood, wet leaves, and smoke hung heavy in the humid air as the young nurse stumbled through the undergrowth, her uniform torn and darkened with crimson. She was only 20 years old, barely past girlhood, but she carried herself with the rigid bearing drilled into her by months of training. Bushido, they told her, demanded death before surrender. Capture was dishonor worse than death. If the enemy took her alive, she had been warned, she would be tortured, humiliated, stripped of every shred of dignity. She clutched at the gash along her thigh, the pain burning with every step, and thought perhaps this was the place to die. But the gunfire had already closed in. The voices were foreign, sharp, and strange, echoing through the trees. English. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. She had heard stories how the Americans mocked prisoners, mutilated them, laughed as they begged for mercy. Her instructors at the nursing school had shown them crude drawings, pamphlets that painted the enemy as beasts with wolfish grins. Even now, as the shadows of their helmets came into view, she felt her body brace for the inevitable blow. She fell to her knees, not out of choice, but from weakness. The wound on her leg had begun to pulse, sticky warmth soaking through the fabric. Her hair clung to her forehead, her lips cracked from thirst. When the soldier's shadow loomed over her, she closed her eyes, waiting for the end. It did not come. Instead, she heard a voice low, cautious, but not cruel. The words meant nothing to her, but the tone startled her. Then came the touch. A hand, gloved, yet oddly gentle, pressed against her arm. She flinched, but the soldier did not strike. Another figure appeared, kneeling beside her. A bag opened, the faint metallic rattle of instruments. She caught the glint of scissors, needle, gauze. A medic. He gestured, pointed to her leg, then to himself. She did not understand. She shook her head violently, heart hammering. Was this a trick? A new kind of torture? The medic's face, half shadowed beneath his helmet, betrayed no malice, only focus. Slowly, he poured clear water from a canteen over the wound. She gasped, biting down on her lip. The water stung, but it was cleaner than anything she had seen in weeks. Her training screamed at her. Resist. Do not yield. But her body betrayed her. When he pressed the bandage against her thigh, she did not push him away. The others stood nearby, rifles slung, watching. One offered something small, wrapped in brown paper. Bread. He tore it in half and held it out to her. Her hands trembled. She shook her head again, whispering, "Uso da, it must be a lie." But the scent reached her, warm, yeasty, unlike the meager rations of rice she had lived on. Against her will, her mouth watered. Her fear tangled with hunger, disbelief with desperation. She took the bread, fingers brushing against his. She half expected him to laugh, to snatch it back. He did not. They gave her water next. Real water, cool and plentiful, not the murky liquid she had boiled from streams. She sipped, then gulped, then coughed, as it flooded her dry throat. A blanket followed, thick wool, olive drab, smelling faintly of sweat and smoke. They draped it over her shoulders, and she stiffened again, certain this was some cruel performance before the knife. Yet when she looked up, the men had already turned away, speaking among themselves, leaving her the small dignity of privacy. The contradiction was unbearable. All her life, she had been told capture meant dishonor, that the enemy would strip her humanity. Yet here they were bandaging her wound, offering bread and water, giving her warmth against the chill of night. No mocking laughter, no blows, no degradation. Her chest tightened with confusion. Was this mercy? Or some trap so elaborate she could not see its edges? As the night deepened, she lay wrapped in that foreign blanket, listening to the strange cadence of English around her. The soldiers laughed at something, but not at her. A harmonica played, soft, mournful, unlike any sound she had ever known. The music drifted through the trees, almost tender, like a lullaby. She closed her eyes, heart torn between fear and a forbidden comfort. Part of her longed to believe this kindness was real. Another part, louder, harsher, insisted it was weakness to hope. But as she drifted into uneasy sleep, the warmth of the bandage on her leg and the lingering taste of bread on her tongue whispered a truth she could not yet admit. The world she had been taught to fear was already beginning to unravel. The first morning in the camp began with a smell so foreign, so overwhelming, that she thought for a moment she was dreaming. The air carried the rich, savory aroma of frying meat, mingled with the sharp bitterness of something roasted coffee, though she did not yet know the word. For years she had grown used to the thin gruel of rice, the occasional scrap of dried fish, meals that left her stomach hollow even when the bowl was empty. But here, as the bugle call echoed across the compound, the scent itself was enough to make her knees tremble. She followed the other prisoners in silence, clutching her blanket tightly around her. Rows of wooden tables stretched across the mess hall, and on each tray that passed by, she saw impossible luxuries: scrambled eggs, bright as the morning sun, slabs of bread thick with butter, slices of meat that glistened with grease. She blinked, certain her eyes were deceiving her. When her own tray was set down before her, she stared. Eggs, yes. Bread, yes. But then, a strange, pale substance spread across the bread's surface, smooth, glossy, faintly golden. She sniffed, wrinkled her nose, and tasted. It clung to the roof of her mouth, salty and sweet at once. Peanut butter. The other Japanese women at her table murmured, giggled nervously, some spitting it out, others licking, cautiously, as though the food might reveal itself to be poisoned. One whispered that perhaps this was how the Americans softened their prisoners, fattening them like pigs before slaughter. Yet no slaughter came. Instead, a soldier in a clean uniform walked by, nodded, and said a word she did not understand, but his smile, fleeting though it was, carried no cruelty. For the first time in months, she ate until she was full, completely full. The silence at the table was thick, almost reverent. To eat without rationing each bite, without counting grains of rice, without listening to the gnaw of her own belly, it was not simply a meal, it was a revelation. Life in the camp unfolded with similar contradictions. Each prisoner was assigned a bunk, clean sheets, and a blanket of her own. At night she lay down and felt the unfamiliar firmness of a mattress beneath her, the strange weight of warmth above. For so long she had slept on the earth itself, body pressed into mud, or on straw mats riddled with lice. Now she lay awake, staring at the wooden beams above, trying to understand how captivity could offer comfort she had never known in freedom. Days passed in a rhythm that felt almost like routine, almost like peace. There were voluntary work details, tending small gardens within the wire fence, peeling potatoes in the kitchen, sweeping walkways. No whips cracked, no guards shouted. The Americans called them by name, stumbling over the syllables, but trying nonetheless. It startled her the first time someone remembered hers. She had expected to be reduced to a number, stripped of identity. Instead, she was treated as if she mattered, even in her enemy's eyes. Books appeared, thick with foreign letters. Some prisoners who knew a little English began to whisper translations, pointing to words, tracing letters in the dirt. Soon, notebooks passed hand to hand, filled with careful attempts at the alphabet. For the young nurse, each word learned was a small bridge across the chasm of fear. Water, bread, thank you. The language of the enemy was no longer only shouts on the battlefield. It became a way to ask, to answer, to connect. Letters were permitted too. She held the thin paper in her hand, heart racing as she wrote to her parents for the first time in years. Would the letter reach them? Would her words be read by censors? Perhaps, but the mere act of writing "I am alive" felt like reclaiming part of herself she had thought lost forever. Not everything was easy. The prisoners often laughed at their own bewilderment. The Americans offered new foods, jellies that quivered, bright orange sodas that fizzed in their mouths, butter so rich it made them queasy. One evening, a guard played a harmonica by the barracks, its melancholy tune drifting through the dusk. Some women wept, others sat transfixed. The sound was unlike anything in their traditions. A voice made of metal and breath that spoke directly to the heart. Yet beneath the strangeness, a surreal truth settled in. The camp was not a place of torment, but of quiet survival. Within the wire fences, there was no hunger, no bombardment, no endless drills under shouting officers. For women who had lived through years of shortages since 1941, whose families measured dinner in mouthfuls, this was not merely imprisonment, it was an inversion of the world. Captivity, against all reason, had begun to feel safer than freedom. Still, the contradiction gnawed at her. Every kindness felt like a betrayal of her oath, every meal like a theft of honor. When she lay on her bunk at night, blanket tucked under her chin, she thought of her comrades who had died refusing to surrender, their bodies claimed by the jungle. She remembered her instructors' voices, fierce and unyielding, declaring that women of Japan must bite their tongues, smash their own skulls with rocks, anything rather than fall into enemy hands. And yet, here she was, alive, unharmed, warm. Each day widened the crack in her certainty. Propaganda had painted the enemy as monsters, yet the faces she saw were simply men tired, sometimes stern, sometimes laughing, always human. She found herself caught in a strange paradise, where the comforts of life whispered that perhaps everything she had believed was not the truth at all. The bowl of stew steamed before her, the rich scent curling upward, filling the air with warmth, carrots, potatoes, chunks of beef, so plentiful it looked more like a festival meal than rations. The young nurse stared at it, unmoving, her hands trembling in her lap. Around her, other women had already begun to eat, their spoons clinking softly against metal, but she could not. Her instructors' voices rang in her head. The Americans are cunning. They will poison you, humiliate you, strip you of dignity before they kill you. Every lesson, every poster, every whispered rumor, had prepared her for this moment of betrayal. To lift the spoon was to defy everything she had been taught. She gripped it anyway, her knuckles white, and raised a tentative bite to her lips. The stew was hot, savory, tender in a way food had never been back home. She swallowed, then waited, braced for the sickness, the burning in her gut that would prove the warnings true. Nothing came. Only warmth spread through her stomach, followed by a shame so sharp it brought tears to her eyes. She set the spoon down, staring at her reflection in the greasy surface of the broth. How many of her own countrymen, captured by the Japanese, had been starved, beaten, left to rot in bamboo cages? She had heard whispers even during her training, stories carried by soldiers who returned from guarding Allied POWs, half-dead men crawling in the dirt, begging for water, beaten if they faltered. Those stories had been told with pride, as proof of Japan's discipline and honor. Yet here she sat, her belly full, her wounds healed, a blanket on her shoulders. The contradiction was unbearable. Some nights, the shame turned inward, dark and violent. She would sit on her bunk clutching a shard of glass she had hidden, thinking that perhaps she should end it herself. A true daughter of the Empire should not live like this, pampered by the enemy, betraying comrades who had chosen death. More than once, she pressed the edge against her skin, testing the sharpness, feeling the thin sting. But always, she hesitated. Something small and stubborn kept her hand from pushing further. That something was not loyalty, but the quiet weight of small mercies. The blanket, scratchy and thick, carried a human warmth. The spectacles, given by a camp clerk after noticing her squint, allowed her to read again. The packet of seeds she had been given for gardening duty, tiny, fragile things, reminded her that life could grow even in the most unlikely soil. These were not weapons, they were tokens of dignity, offered freely. Each one whispered a dangerous truth, that she was still human, even here. Slowly, the fear that had once paralyzed her gave way to curiosity. She began to watch the Americans more closely, studying the way they carried themselves. They were not demons. They argued among themselves, joked, cursed when the heat was unbearable, shivered when the rains came. They looked weary, sometimes even younger than she was. And they treated one another with a kind of casual equality she had never seen at home. Officers eating beside enlisted men, laughter shared without rigid bows or endless hierarchies. It was unsettling, even incomprehensible, yet also oddly liberating to witness. English words slipped into her mind, first as sounds, then as meaning. She practiced them in secret, whispering under her breath, "Water, bread, thank you." The first time she used them, stumbling, the soldier she addressed blinked in surprise, then smiled. A real smile, unguarded. She felt something inside her shift, though she could not name it yet. The propaganda that had once been absolute now seemed brittle, fragile as paper left out in the rain. The image of the merciless American dissolved with every bite of stew, every page of a borrowed book, every gentle word spoken across the wire. She felt the ground of her identity trembling beneath her. If the enemy was not a monster, then what did that make of the empire that had raised her to believe so? At night, she thought of home, of her mother bent over an empty pot, of her father's weary hands, of neighbors clutching ration tickets like lifelines. She imagined what they would say if they knew that she was safe, fed, even learning. Would they call her a traitor, or would they envy her? The shame did not disappear. It lived alongside the gratitude, twisting her insides. But the longer she remained in the camp, the more that shame turned into doubt, not of herself, but of everything she had been told to believe. And doubt, once planted, grew like the seeds in her small garden patch. The sea was gray, restless, and endless. The repatriation ship groaned as it cut across the waves, carrying its cargo of women homeward. On the deck, they huddled in worn American coats, clutching bundles of belongings against the salt wind. Some held blankets from the camp, folded carefully, as if they were treasures. Others gripped small parcels of food or letters tied with string. The young nurse stood at the rail, eyes fixed on the horizon, her fingers tracing the rim of the spectacles she now wore. The world through them was clearer than it had ever been, yet what awaited her beyond that line of sea and sky was anything but. When the coastline of Japan finally emerged, there was no triumphant cheer, only silence. The land looked skeletal ribs of burned-out buildings, bones of factories reduced to rubble, villages pockmarked with craters. Smoke still curled from some chimneys, but the air smelled not of homecoming but of ash. She pressed her forehead against the cold metal rail and felt the bitter truth. She had been safer, more nourished, even more human, inside the enemy's wire fence than in the embrace of her homeland. At the docks, gaunt figures waited, mothers, brothers, children, faces hollowed by hunger, eyes too tired to weep. Reunions unfolded not with laughter but with stunned recognition, as if the living had returned from the grave. The nurse searched the crowd until she saw them. Her parents, thinner than she remembered, her mother's kimono patched with clumsy stitches, her father's back bent like a broken reed. They embraced without words, tears soaking into cloth. Yet behind their relief lurked questions unspoken. Where had she been? What had they done to her? She wanted to tell them everything, the clean bed, the food, the kindness, but the words died on her lips. How could she say that captivity had preserved her better than loyalty? How could she admit that in the enemy's camp she had learned gentleness, even dignity? The paradox lodged in her throat like a stone. The days that followed deepened the wound. Streets once busy were now wastelands of rubble. Children scavenged in garbage heaps. Women traded heirlooms for a handful of rice. Hunger gnawed at every household. In the evenings, survivors gathered to speak of their losses. Sons dead in Burma, husbands vanished at sea, entire neighborhoods incinerated in the firebombings. In that silence heavy with grief, the returned prisoners spoke little of their time abroad. To say too much invited suspicion, even hatred. Some whispered that POWs had been collaborators, tainted by enemy hands. Others turned their eyes away, unable to reconcile the idea of survival with honor. She carried her memories like contraband. At night, lying on the tatami of her childhood home, she would unfold her American blanket, careful not to let her parents see, and breathe in its faint foreign scent. It reminded her of nights when, for the first time in years, she had dated away, not been cold. She touched the frame of her spectacles, remembering the clerk who had handed them to her without mockery, simply because she needed to see. In the pocket of her coat, she still carried a packet of seeds, unused, their promise of life undiminished. These objects became her secret shrine, proof that the world was not as simple as she had once been told. Yet the weight of silence grew heavier. When neighbors asked about her time in captivity, she answered with vague phrases, "We managed. It was difficult. I was fortunate to return alive." She could not bear to tell them of the eggs and meat, the harmonica music, the books. To admit the truth felt like betrayal. And yet, to deny it entirely felt like erasing the part of herself that had been born in that camp. She walked through the ruins and saw paradox everywhere. Her homeland, once exalted as sacred and invincible, lay broken, starving. The enemy, once vilified as barbaric, had shown her tenderness. Freedom now tasted harsher than captivity. The young nurse found herself caught between two realities. Memory tugged her one way toward the moments of kindness that had sustained her. Reality pulled her another toward the ruins of an empire that demanded silence, demanded loyalty, demanded that she bury her doubts beneath layers of ash. In the quiet of night, listening to the faint rustle of rats in the ruined streets, she asked herself a question she dared not voice aloud. If honor had meant death, and dishonor had meant survival, then what was left to believe in? She adjusted the spectacles on her face, the round lenses catching the pale light of morning. For the first time, she saw the world not in blurred outlines, but in sharp detail. The cracks in the wooden doorframe, the threads fraying on her mother's sleeve, the faint veins on a leaf outside the window. It struck her, as it had in the camp, that clarity could come not only to the eyes, but to the heart. The spectacles had been a simple gift, given without ceremony by a foreign clerk who noticed her squinting at the page of a book. Yet they had become her most enduring possession, more precious than any medal or decoration her nation could bestow. Through them she had learned to read letters again, to decipher the strange shapes of English words, to see a world that refused to fit inside the rigid boundaries of propaganda. Even now, back in Japan's ruins, they reminded her of a quiet truth. Dignity could be restored not by power or victory, but by kindness. In the months after her return, she saw the same objects resurfacing among other former prisoners. A blanket folded carefully in a drawer, a harmonica wrapped in cloth, a notebook of English phrases hidden beneath futons. Each item carried a story, and together they formed a hidden tapestry of survival. None of these women spoke loudly of what they had lived, but the evidence lingered in their belongings. It was as though captivity had left behind, not scars, but seeds. Seeds that might one day grow into a different way of seeing the world. The transformation was not sudden. Shame still shadowed her steps. Silence still bound her tongue. Yet within her, something had shifted irreversibly. She no longer believed in monsters made of flesh and blood. She had seen American medics kneel beside the wounded, had heard laughter that was not cruel, had tasted food offered without condition. These experiences unraveled the tight knot of fear and hatred that once defined her loyalty. They did not erase her grief, nor absolve her country's defeat. But they revealed a truth that no officer, no pamphlet, no emperor could command her to forget. That dignity survived even in the hands of the enemy. Years later, when peace began to take root, she noticed how easily the story of the war slipped into myth. People preferred simple tales, heroes and villains, loyalty and betrayal, honor and shame. She said little, yet carried a different story inside her. It was not a story of battles or flags, but of small mercies, a blanket against the cold, a spoonful of stew when hunger gnawed, a voice calling her name with imperfect care. These moments had not won the war, but they had won her life. Sometimes, when she walked through the streets of rebuilt cities, she wondered if anyone else remembered what captivity had given them. Did others still keep their blankets, their notebooks, their seeds? Did they, too, feel the strange dissonance of having been treated more gently by an enemy than by their own empire? She never asked aloud, but she believed the answer was yes, and in that quiet belief lay a revolution. Not the kind that raised banners or toppled governments, but the kind that changed a person from within. For her, the revolution was simple. She had learned to see herself not as a tool of the state, not as a symbol of sacrifice, but as a human being whose worth was recognized even in the darkest of times. The war had tried to strip her of that worth, to make her body only a vessel for loyalty, her mind only a canvas for fear. Yet a few simple acts of kindness, a bandage pressed gently to her leg, bread shared without mockery, spectacles offered with no demand in return had restored what ideology tried to erase. Now, when she thought of honor, she did not think of death before surrender. She thought of the American medic's hands, steady and patient, saving her life. When she thought of dignity, she did not see the emperor's portrait gazing down from a shrine. She saw instead the worn blanket folded at the foot of her bed, a reminder that dignity could be protected even in captivity. War, she realized, had many victors and many victims. But kindness, rare, fragile, and often unnoticed, was the only force that could transform enemies into something else. Not friends, perhaps, not yet, but humans. As she lifted her spectacles again and looked out at the world, she felt the truth settle. Deep within her, the smallest gestures could outlast empires. A blanket, a letter, a pair of glasses, these were not weapons, but they were more powerful than any sword. They were the quiet revolution of dignity, the proof that even in the ruins of war, humanity could survive.